I was having breakfast when I noticed faint bruises on my maid's wrists. She smiled, as always, but something felt off. I asked softly, "Did you fall?" She looked down and whispered, "It's nothing, sir. Please don't ask." That sentence stuck with me. After she left the room, I checked the hallway cameras. My heart dropped. Her husband had dropped her off earlier, and he grabbed her arm so hard it left marks. I ran to her room and asked again. She broke down in tears. He said if I told anyone, he'd find me. I didn't wait a second. I called the cops right there, handed them the footage, and told her she'd never go back to that house again. She's safe now, and I'll never ignore a silent cry for help again. The morning light filtered through the Venetian blinds of my downtown Chicago apartment, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. I sat at my kitchen island, the familiar routine of breakfast unfolding as it had for the past 3 years. The sound of gentle footsteps announced Maria's arrival as she entered with her cleaning supplies, her movements as predictable as the sunrise itself. Maria Gonzalez had been working for me since I moved into this high-rise apartment after my divorce. She was a woman of few words, always professional, always wearing that same gentle smile that seemed to mask something deeper. Her English was accented but clear, and she took pride in her work, treating my home with the same care she might have given her own. I was scrolling through my phone, catching up on the morning news, when I glanced up to see Maria arranging fresh flowers in the vase on my dining table. That's when I noticed them faint purple marks wrapped around her wrists like silent accusations. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The bruises had that sickly yellow-green tinge that spoke of healing trauma. My coffee cup paused halfway to my lips. Maria had always been careful about her appearance, her uniform always pristine, her hair neatly pulled back. But these marks were impossible to hide completely, and in the bright morning light streaming through my east-facing windows, they stood out like dark secrets against her olive skin. "Maria," I said softly, setting down my cup. The gentle clink of ceramic against granite seemed to startle her. "Did you fall recently?" She turned toward me, and for just a moment, I saw something flicker across her features, fear, perhaps, or resignation. But then that familiar smile returned, the one that had greeted me every morning for 3 years, though now it seemed forced, like a mask she wore to protect herself from the world. "It's nothing, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the hum of the refrigerator. "Please don't ask." Those 5 words hit me like a physical blow. The way she said them, the pleading quality in her voice, the way her shoulders seemed to shrink inward as if she were trying to make herself invisible, it all spoke of a pain that went far deeper than any physical injury. I wanted to push, to demand answers, to understand what had happened to this woman who had become such a constant presence in my life. But something in her posture, in the way she quickly turned back to her work, told me that pressing now would only cause her to retreat further into herself. "Of course," I managed to say, though every instinct screamed at me to probe deeper. "I just ... If you ever need anything, Maria, anything at all, you know you can talk to me, right?" She nodded without looking at me, her movements becoming more hurried as she gathered her supplies. "Thank you, Mr. Richardson. I should start upstairs now." As she disappeared up the staircase, her footsteps quick and light, I remained frozen at my kitchen island, staring at the space where she had stood. The morning routine continued around me, traffic noise from the street below, the distant sound of elevators carrying my neighbors to their daily lives, the gentle hum of my apartment's heating system. But everything felt different now, charged with an awareness I couldn't shake. I tried to return to my breakfast, to lose myself in emails and news articles, but my mind kept returning to those bruises, to the way Maria's voice had trembled when she asked me not to ask. In all the time she had worked for me, she had never made such a request. She had always been open to small talk, comfortable discussing the weather or her weekend plans. This was different. This was a woman asking to be left alone with her pain. 20 minutes later, I heard the front door close Maria's signal that she was finished for the day. I glanced at the clock, 9:30 a.m., exactly on schedule. But instead of feeling the usual satisfaction of a well-maintained routine, I felt a growing unease that settled in my stomach like a stone. I sat there for another 10 minutes, unable to focus on anything productive, before a thought struck me. My building had security cameras in all the hallways, and I had access to the footage through the building's resident portal. I had never used it before, had never had a reason to, but now I found myself logging into the system with trembling fingers. The hallway camera showed a clear view of my apartment door and the elevator bank. I scrolled back to earlier that morning, around 8:45 a.m., when Maria typically arrived. The timestamp showed 8:43 a.m. when the elevator doors opened and Maria stepped out, but she wasn't alone. A man followed her, tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair and wearing a worn leather jacket. Even through the grainy security footage, I could see the tension in Maria's posture as she walked ahead of him toward my door. They stopped just outside my apartment, and what I saw next made my blood run cold. The man grabbed Maria's arm, his fingers wrapping around her wrist with obvious force. She winced, her body language screaming discomfort, but she didn't pull away. He leaned in close, saying something I couldn't hear, his grip tightening. When he finally released her, she rubbed her wrist, the same wrist where I had noticed the bruises, and nodded quickly before using her key to enter my apartment. The man watched her disappear inside, then turned and walked back to the elevator, his movements casual, as if what had just happened was perfectly normal. As if causing pain to another human being was just another part of his morning routine. I stared at the screen, my hands clenched into fists. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a fall or a mishap. This was deliberate, calculated violence, and it was happening to someone I saw every day. Someone I had grown to care about even if I had never fully realized it until now. My first instinct was to call the police immediately, but something held me back. I needed to talk to Maria first to understand the full situation. If this man was her husband, as I suspected, then there were likely complications, financial dependence, children, threats, all the complex web of control that kept victims trapped in abusive relationships. I waited, pacing my apartment like a caged animal until the next morning. When I heard Maria's key in the lock at 8:45 a.m., I was waiting in the living room, having barely slept the night before. She entered with her usual quiet efficiency, but I could see the careful way she moved, the slight favor she gave to her left side. "Maria," I said, standing up as she entered. "We need to talk." She froze, her cleaning supplies clutched in her hands like a shield. "Is there a problem with my work, Mr. Richardson?" "No, your work is perfect. It's always been perfect." I moved closer, but not too close, not wanting to make her feel trapped. "It's about yesterday. About what I saw." Her face went pale. "I don't understand." "I saw the security footage, Maria. I saw him grab your arm. I saw him hurt you." For a moment, she just stared at me, her eyes wide with what looked like terror. Then, as if a dam had burst, she began to cry. Not the gentle tears of sadness, but the harsh, racking sobs of someone who had been holding back an ocean of pain. "Please," she gasped between sobs. "Please don't. He said if I told anyone, he'd find me. He said he'd make it worse." I felt my heart break for this woman who had been suffering in silence, who had smiled at me every morning while carrying the weight of abuse. "Maria, you don't have to protect him. You don't have to protect anyone who hurts you." "You don't understand," she said, sinking into one of my dining chairs. "He's my husband. We have children. He says if I leave, he'll take them away from me. He says no one will believe me because I'm just a cleaning lady." "That's not true," I said firmly, grabbing my phone from the coffee table. "None of that is true. You're not just anything. You're a human being who deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. What are you doing?" she asked, panic creeping into her voice as she saw me dialing. "I'm calling the police. I have footage of him assaulting you, Maria. That's evidence." "That's proof." "No, please." She reached for my phone, but I gently moved it away. "I'm not going to let you go back to that house," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I'm not going to let you go back to him." The 911 operator answered on the second ring. 911, what's your emergency? "I need to report a domestic violence situation. I have video evidence of an assault and the victim is here with me now." As I spoke to the operator, giving them my address and explaining the situation, I watched Maria's face cycle through a range of emotions: fear, hope, despair, and finally, something that might have been relief. When I hung up, she was still crying, but more quietly now. "They'll be here in 10 minutes, I said, sitting down across from her. "Maria, I know this is scary, but you're doing the right thing. You're protecting yourself and your children. What if he finds out? What if he comes here?" she asked, her voice shaking. "He won't. The police will make sure of that. And if he needs somewhere to stay, somewhere safe, we'll figure that out too." The next hour passed in a blur of uniforms and questions. 2 officers arrived first, Officer Patricia Chan and Officer Michael Rodriguez, both of whom spoke to Maria with a gentleness that seemed to help her relax slightly. They took her statement while I provided them with the security footage I had downloaded to my laptop. "This is clear evidence of assault," Officer Chan said after reviewing the video. "We'll be issuing a warrant for his arrest." "What about Maria?" I asked. "What about her safety?" "We can help her apply for a restraining order," Officer Rodriguez explained. "And there are shelters, resources for women in her situation." "I have a guest room," I said without thinking. "If she needs somewhere to stay while she gets on her feet, she can stay here." Both officers looked at me with raised eyebrows, and I realized how it might sound a wealthy single man offering housing to his vulnerable employee. But Maria looked up at me with something like gratitude in her eyes. "You would do that?" she asked. "Of course." "You're not going back to that house, Maria. Not today, not ever." The legal process that followed was complex and emotionally draining. Maria's husband, Roberto Gonzalez, was arrested that afternoon at his construction job. The charges included assault, battery, and making terrorist threats based on Maria's testimony about his previous warnings to keep quiet. During the court proceedings, a fuller picture of Maria's situation emerged. She had been married to Roberto for 12 years, and the abuse had been escalating over the past 3. She had been working multiple cleaning jobs to support the family while he drank away much of his construction wages. She had 2 children, Sophia, age 10, and Carlos, age 8, who she had been trying to protect from witnessing their father's violence. The legal system, while not perfect, worked in Maria's favor. Roberto was sentenced to anger management counseling and a year of probation with a strict no-contact order. More importantly, Maria was granted primary custody of the children, with Roberto allowed only supervised visits. But the legal victory was just the beginning of Maria's journey toward healing. She stayed in my guest room for 3 weeks while she looked for a new apartment, and during that time, I got to know her not as my employee but as a person. I learned that she had been a teacher in Mexico before immigrating to the United States, that she loved to read mystery novels, that she made the most incredible pozole I had ever tasted. I also learned about the depth of trauma that domestic violence leaves behind. Maria would wake up screaming from nightmares, convinced that Roberto had found her. She would flinch when I moved too quickly or raised my voice while talking on the phone. She checked and rechecked the locks on my doors multiple times each night, but I also watched her slowly begin to heal. She started attending a support group for domestic violence survivors. She reconnected with her children, who had been staying with her sister during the initial crisis. She began to smile again, not the forced smile she had worn for years, but a genuine expression of emerging joy. One evening, about a month after that first morning when I had noticed the bruises, Maria was sitting at my kitchen table helping Sophia with homework while Carlos played with toy cars on the living room floor. The scene was so domestic, so peacefully normal, that it took me a moment to recognize the profound transformation that had taken place. "Mr. Richardson," Maria said, looking up from Sophia's math worksheet. "I got a call today from Lincoln Elementary. They have an opening for a bilingual teaching assistant. The principal wants to interview me tomorrow." "That's wonderful," I said, and I meant it. "You'll be perfect for that job." "I'm scared," she admitted. "It's been so long since I worked with children professionally. What if I'm not good enough?" "You're more than good enough," I said firmly. "You're exactly what those children need, someone who understands what it means to overcome fear, to find strength when everything seems impossible." She smiled then, that new smile that had nothing to do with politeness or self-protection. I never thought I would feel hopeful again. 3 months ago, I thought this was just my life, that I deserved what was happening to me. "You never deserved any of it," I said. "No one deserves to be treated the way he treated you." "I know that now," she said. "But knowing it and believing it are different things, aren't they?" I nodded, understanding more than I had expected to about the long journey from surviving to thriving. It takes time. But you're already so much stronger than you realize. The job interview went well, and Maria was offered the position starting the following Monday. She found a small apartment in a safe neighborhood near the school, and I helped her and the children move in. As we carried boxes up the stairs to her new home, I couldn't help but think about how different everything had become since that morning when I had noticed the bruises on her wrists. "You know," Maria said as we took a break from moving, sitting on her new couch surrounded by unpacked boxes, "I used to think that asking for help was a sign of weakness. In Mexico, we have a saying, el que no tiene Congo, tiene Carabali, roughly, everyone has their own burdens to carry. I thought that meant I had to carry mine alone." "What changed your mind?" I asked. "You," she said simply. "You saw what I was trying to hide and you didn't look away. You didn't make it my problem to solve alone." That morning when you called the police, I was terrified, but I was also not relieved. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone with my fear. Sophia ran into the room then, excited about her new bedroom, and the moment passed. But her words stayed with me as I drove home to my apartment, which felt strangely empty without Maria's presence. The next few months fell into a new rhythm. Maria would bring the children to visit sometimes on weekends, and I would take them to Navy Pier or the zoo. Sophia was a bright student who loved to read, and Carlos was fascinated by my collection of vintage cameras. They felt like family in a way I hadn't expected. Maria thrived in her new job. She called me one evening, breathless with excitement, to tell me about a student who had been struggling with both English and mathematics until Maria found a way to teach him using Spanish-language word problems that connected to his family's restaurant business. "You should have seen his face when he finally understood the concept," she said. "It was like watching a light bulb turn on." "You're a natural teacher," I said. "You always have been." "I'm thinking about going back to school," she said. "There's a program at the community college that would help me get my teaching credentials recognized here. It would take 2 years, but you want to do it," I finished for her. "Yes, I want to do it. A year ago, I couldn't imagine any future beyond just surviving each day. Now I'm planning 2 years ahead." "I'm proud of you," I said, and I meant it completely. The legal proceedings continued to unfold over the following months. Roberto was required to attend anger management classes and alcohol counseling, and he was slowly granted limited supervised visits with his children. Maria was initially terrified of any contact between Roberto and the kids. But her therapist helped her understand that completely cutting off their father might harm Sofia and Carlos in the long run. The first supervised visit took place at a family services center, with Maria waiting in the parking lot while a social worker monitored Roberto's interaction with the children. When Sofia and Carlos came out after the 2-hour visit, they were quiet and thoughtful. "How was it?" Maria asked gently as they drove home. "Dad said he was sorry," Sofia said. "He said he's been sick, but he's getting better. He looked different," Carlos added. "Smaller somehow." Maria told me about this conversation later, over coffee at a cafe near her apartment. "I don't know how to feel about it," she said. "Part of me wants to protect them from him completely. But another part of me knows that he's their father, and they need to understand what happened and why." "There's no perfect answer," I said. "But the fact that you're thinking about what's best for them, not what's easiest for you, shows what a good mother you are." "I'm learning," she said. "We all are." As winter gave way to spring, Maria's confidence continued to grow. She enrolled in the teaching credential program and began taking evening classes while continuing to work at the elementary school. The children adjusted well to their new life, making friends in their new neighborhood and excelling in school. One evening in May, nearly a year after that first morning when I had noticed the bruises, Maria invited me to a school event where Sofia was receiving an award for academic excellence. Sitting in the crowded auditorium, watching Sofia beam with pride as she accepted her certificate, I felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond anything I had achieved in my own career. After the ceremony, as we walked through the school hallways looking at student artwork displayed on the walls, Maria stopped in front of a poster that Sofia had made for a project about heroes. "Who is your hero?" The assignment had asked, and Sofia had written, "My hero is my mom because she is brave and strong and she saved our family." Maria's eyes filled with tears as she read her daughter's words. "She thinks I'm the hero," she whispered. "You are," I said. "You're the one who found the courage to speak up, to accept help, to build a new life for yourself and your children." "I couldn't have done it without you," she said. "Without someone who saw past my silence and recognized my pain." "You would have found a way," I said. "Maybe not that day, but eventually. You're stronger than you know." As we left the school that evening, with Sofia and Carlos running ahead of us toward the parking lot, Maria turned to me with a question that had obviously been on her mind. "Why did you help me?" she asked. "Really? You could have just minded your own business, pretended not to notice. Why did you get involved?" I thought about her question as we reached my car. It was something I had asked myself many times over the past year, and the answer had evolved as I had come to understand my own motivations better. "I think," I said slowly, "that we all have moments when we can choose to look away or to step forward. When I saw those bruises, when I heard the way you asked me not to ask, I knew I was at one of those moments. I could pretend I hadn't seen anything, or I could acknowledge that someone I cared about was in pain. But I was just your cleaning lady," she said. "You were never just anything," I said firmly. "You were a person who showed up to my home every day, who took care of my space, who brightened my mornings with your smile. You were someone who mattered, even if neither of us fully realized it at the time." Later that night, as I sat in my apartment thinking about the year that had passed, I realized that Maria's question had forced me to confront something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. Helping her hadn't just been about doing the right thing. It had been about recognizing that my own life had been missing something essential. Before that morning when I noticed the bruises, I had been living a comfortable but isolated existence. I went to work, I came home, I maintained my routines. My interactions with other people were superficial, professional, carefully controlled. I had built a life that was safe and predictable, but it was also lonely in ways I hadn't wanted to admit. Getting involved in Maria's situation had broken down the walls I had built around my own life. It had forced me to acknowledge that real connection, real meaning, Comey's from being willing to see and respond to other people's pain, not from maintaining comfortable distance. 6 months later, I attended Maria's graduation ceremony from the teaching credential program. She had worked incredibly hard, balancing her job, her coursework, and her responsibilities as a single mother. Watching her walk across the stage to receive her certificate, I felt a pride that was different from anything I had experienced before. What's next? I asked her at the small celebration dinner we had afterward. I've been offered a full-time teaching position at Lincoln Elementary, she said, grinning. 3rd grade. I'll be teaching the same age group as Carlos. That's perfect, I said. And I've been thinking about buying a house, she continued. Nothing fancy, but something that belongs to us. Somewhere the kids can have their own rooms, maybe a small backyard. Have you been looking at anything specific? There's a place about 10 minutes from here. It needs work, but it has good bones. The realtor says it's been on the market for a while because it needs updating, but that means the price is reasonable. I could see the excitement in her eyes as she described the house, and I found myself wanting to help make her dream a reality. Would you like me to take a look at it with you? I know a good contractor who could give you an honest assessment of what needs to be done. Would you really? She asked. I've never bought a house before. In Mexico, we always rented, and here. Well, buying a house wasn't something I ever thought I could do. Of course, we'll make sure you get a fair deal. The house was a small bungalow built in the 1940s, with hardwood floors that needed refinishing and a kitchen that belonged in a museum. But it had character, and more importantly, it had potential. The contractor I brought in confirmed that the structure was sound and that the cosmetic issues could be addressed over time. It's perfect, Maria said as we stood in the empty living room, sunlight streaming through the windows. I can already picture Sofia doing homework at a table by that window and Carlos playing in the backyard. Then let's make it happen, I said. The home buying process was complicated by Maria's limited credit history and the fact that she was still relatively new to her full-time teaching position. But she was determined, and with some help from a first-time homebuyer program and a patient mortgage broker, she was able to secure financing. The day Maria got her keys, she called me from the house, crying with joy. I own a house, she said through her tears. I own a house, and no one can take it away from me. No one can, I agreed. It's yours. You earned it. That weekend, I helped Maria and the children move into their new home. As we carried boxes and furniture from the moving truck, I couldn't help but think about the journey that had brought us all to this moment. 3 years ago, Maria had been trapped in an abusive marriage, afraid to speak up about her pain. Now she was a homeowner with a stable job and a bright future ahead of her. You know, Maria said as we took a break from unpacking, sitting on the front porch while Sofia and Carlos explored their new neighborhood, I never thanked you properly for what you did that morning when you called the police. You don't need to thank me, I said. Anyone would have done the same thing. No, she said firmly, not anyone. Most people would have looked away, minded their own business. You really saw me, and you didn't turn away from what you saw. I'm just glad I paid attention, I said. I'm glad I didn't miss the signs. I think about that sometimes, she said. About how easy it would have been for you to ignore the bruises, to accept my explanation and move on. If you had, I might still be trapped in that house, still living in fear. But you're not, I said. You're here, you're free, you're building a life for yourself and your children. That's what matters. As the sun set over Maria's new neighborhood, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. Not because the story was over. Maria's journey would continue, with new challenges and new triumphs ahead, but because I had learned something essential about the power of paying attention, of refusing to look away when someone needs help. The lesson went beyond domestic violence, beyond the specific circumstances of Maria's situation. It was about the fundamental human responsibility to see and respond to pain, to refuse to let people suffer in silence when we have the power to help. It was about recognizing that everyone has a story, that the people who move through our lives, even in peripheral roles, are whole human beings deserving of dignity and support. In the months that followed, Maria's life continued to stabilize and flourish. She became known at Lincoln Elementary as one of the most compassionate and effective teachers, particularly skilled at working with students who had experienced trauma. Her own experience with abuse had given her a unique ability to recognize when children were struggling and to provide the support they needed. Sophia and Carlos thrived in their new environment. Sophia joined the school's academic decathlon team and talked about wanting to become a doctor. Carlos discovered a talent for art and spent hours drawing elaborate pictures of superheroes and spaceships. They maintained a relationship with their father through supervised visits, but their primary stability came from their mother and their new home. For my part, I found that helping Maria had changed me in ways I was still discovering. I began volunteering at a local domestic violence shelter, helping with their financial literacy programs. I also started paying closer attention to the people around me, really seeing them, not just acknowledging their presence. One morning, about 2 years after that first breakfast when I had noticed the bruises, I was walking to work when I saw a young woman at a bus stop with what looked like fingerprint bruises on her throat. She was trying to cover them with makeup, but the marks were still visible. A year earlier, I might have kept walking, might have told myself it wasn't my business. But I had learned something about the cost of silence, about the importance of speaking up when we see signs of abuse. I approached her carefully, not wanting to startle her or make her feel unsafe. "Excuse me," I said gently. "Are you okay? Do you need help?" She looked up at me with eyes that reminded me of Maria's, fearful, but desperate for someone to notice her pain. I don't know," she whispered. "There are people who can help," I said, pulling out my phone to show her the domestic violence hotline number I had saved after helping Maria. "People who understand what you're going through." That young woman, Jessica, ended up getting help. She left her abusive boyfriend and moved in with her sister in another state. She sends me a holiday card every year, thanking me for noticing what she was trying to hide. There have been others since then, a coworker whose husband controlled her finances, a neighbor whose boyfriend monitored her phone calls, a woman at the grocery store who flinched when her partner raised his voice. Not all of them were ready to accept help when I offered it, but some were. And for those who were, the intervention made a difference. I've learned that recognizing the signs of abuse is only the first step. The harder work is creating an environment where people feel safe to speak up, where they know they won't be judged or abandoned if they admit they're being hurt. It's about building trust, offering resources, and respecting someone's autonomy even when we desperately want to protect them. Maria and I have remained close friends throughout this journey. She's now the head of the bilingual education program at her school, and she's considering pursuing a master's degree in education. Her children are teenagers now. Sophia is 15 and interested in pre-med programs, while Carlos is 13 and has won several art competitions. Sometimes we talk about that morning when everything changed, when I noticed the bruises and decided not to look away. Maria often says that day saved her life, but I think it saved mine too, in a different way. It taught me that a meaningful life isn't about maintaining comfortable routines or avoiding difficult situations. It's about being willing to see pain and respond to it, even when it's inconvenient or complicated. The ripple effects of that single moment of recognition have continued to spread. Maria now speaks at conferences about domestic violence awareness, sharing her story to help others recognize the signs and find the courage to speak up. She's particularly effective at reaching women in immigrant communities who often face additional barriers to seeking help. I've also become involved in advocacy work, supporting legislation that would improve resources for domestic violence survivors and increase training for law enforcement officers who respond to domestic violence calls. It's work that I never would have imagined myself doing before I met Maria, but it feels essential now. Looking back, I realized that the morning I noticed the bruises on Maria's wrists was a turning point not just for her, but for me as well. It was the moment when I learned that paying attention, really paying attention to the people around us, is one of the most important things we can do. It's the moment when I understood that everyone deserves to be seen, to be heard, to be helped when they're in pain. The story doesn't end with Maria's rescue or her recovery. It continues every day, in every interaction where we choose to see people as whole human beings rather than just the roles they play in our lives. It continues in every moment when we decide to speak up rather than look away, to offer help rather than assume someone else will handle it. Maria's courage in accepting help and rebuilding her life has inspired countless others. But it started with a simple recognition that the woman who cleaned my apartment was a person deserving of dignity and safety, and that when I saw evidence that she was being hurt, I had a responsibility to respond. I'll never ignore a silent cry for help again. That's the promise I made to myself that day, and it's the promise I try to keep every day since. Because I've learned that sometimes the most important thing we can do is simply notice when someone is in pain and have the courage to care enough to help. The world is full of people who are suffering in silence, who are hiding their pain behind smiles and professional facades. They're the coworkers who always wear long sleeves, the neighbors who never make eye contact, the service workers who seem to shrink into themselves when certain people are around. They're waiting for someone to notice, someone to care enough to ask the difficult questions and offer genuine help. We all have the power to be that person. We all have the ability to recognize pain and respond to it with compassion and action. It doesn't require special training or professional expertise. It just requires attention, empathy, and the willingness to get involved when someone needs help. Maria's story is one of survival and triumph, but it's also a story about the importance of community, about the responsibility we all have to care for one another. It's a reminder that everyone we meet is carrying a story we know nothing about, and that sometimes the simple act of paying attention can be the first step toward healing. 3 years after Maria moved into her house, she called me with news that would have seemed impossible during those dark days when she was trapped in an abusive marriage. I've been offered a position as the district coordinator for bilingual education, she said, her voice filled with excitement and disbelief. They want me to oversee programs in 15 schools across the district. That's incredible, I said, genuinely amazed at how far she had come. What does that mean for you? It means I'll be developing curriculum, training teachers, and advocating for policies that support immigrant families. It means I'll be using my own experience to help create systems that protect vulnerable children and their families. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. The woman who had once been afraid to speak up about her own abuse was now being asked to be a voice for an entire community of people who often felt voiceless. There's something else, Maria continued. They want me to present at the National Conference on Bilingual Education next month. I'll be speaking about trauma-informed teaching practices and how educators can recognize signs of domestic violence in their students' families. Are you ready for that? I asked, knowing how much courage it would take for her to share her story on such a public platform. I'm terrified, she admitted. But I'm also ready. I think about all the women who might be sitting in the audience, women who are living the life I used to live. If my story can help even one of them find the courage to seek help, then it's worth it. The conference presentation was a turning point in Maria's journey from survivor to advocate. Her speech, titled Seeing Beyond the Surface, How Educators Can Recognize and Respond to Domestic Violence, received a standing ovation. But more importantly, it led to several women approaching her afterward, sharing their own stories and asking for help. One woman, a teacher named Patricia from Houston, told Maria that she had been covering bruises with makeup for 2 years, too ashamed to tell anyone what was happening at home. Another woman, a school counselor from Phoenix, admitted that she had been helping students with trauma while ignoring her own situation of emotional abuse. I realized that night, Maria told me later, that my story wasn't just about me anymore. It was about every woman who has ever felt trapped, who has ever thought she deserved the pain, who has ever believed that no one would care enough to help. Following the conference, Maria was invited to join a national task force on domestic violence prevention in educational settings. She began traveling regularly, conducting workshops for teachers and administrators on recognizing signs of abuse and creating safe environments for students and families. But perhaps the most meaningful development was closer to home. Sophia, now a senior in high school, had been accepted to Northwestern University's pre-med program with a full scholarship. During her application process, she had written her college essay about watching her mother transform from a victim to an advocate, and how that experience had inspired her to pursue a career in medicine with a focus on trauma recovery. "I want to be a doctor who sees the whole person," Sophia told me during one of our regular coffee meetings. "Not just the symptoms, but the story behind them. My mom taught me that healing isn't just about treating physical wounds. It's about understanding the context of someone's pain." Carlos, now 15, had developed his artistic talents into a passion for graphic design and social justice messaging. His artwork often featured powerful images about standing up to bullying and supporting survivors of violence. One of his pieces, a poster showing hands reaching out to help someone climb out of darkness, had won a statewide high school art competition. He's inherited his mother's desire to help others. I observed to Maria one evening as we watched Carlos work on a new piece. "Both of them have," she replied. "But they've also learned something I had to discover the hard way, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom." The ripple effects of Maria's transformation continued to spread in ways none of us could have predicted. Her work with the district led to new policies requiring all school employees to receive training on recognizing signs of domestic violence. Her advocacy efforts contributed to the passage of state legislation providing additional funding for domestic violence shelters and support services. But it was the individual stories that meant the most to her. There was Carmen, a cafeteria worker who found the courage to leave her abusive husband after attending one of Maria's workshops. There was Jennifer, a young teacher who recognized the signs of abuse in her own relationship and sought help before it escalated to physical violence. There was Rosa, a parent who had been too afraid to report her neighbor's domestic violence until Maria's presentation gave her the language and confidence to speak up. "Each story reminds me why this work matters," Maria said during one of our monthly dinners. "It reminds me that the decision you made that morning to notice, to care, to act, didn't just save my life. It created a chain reaction that's still growing." As I listened to her speak, I marveled at the woman sitting across from me. The scared, bruised woman who had whispered, "Please don't ask," in my kitchen had become a powerful advocate, whose voice was being heard in conference rooms and legislative chambers across the country. She had taken her deepest trauma and transformed it into a source of strength and healing for others. "Do you ever regret it?" I asked her one evening as we sat on her front porch, watching Sophia and Carlos play with their cousin's children in the backyard. "Do you ever wish you could go back to a quieter life without all the responsibility that comes with being a public advocate?" She considered the question seriously, watching the children run and laugh in the golden hour light. "Sometimes I think about what my life would have been like if I had never found the courage to speak up that morning. I would probably still be with Roberto, still covering bruises, still teaching my children that suffering in silence is normal." She paused, taking a deep breath. But then I think about all the women who have reached out to me, all the families who have been helped by the programs we've created, all the children who are growing up in safer homes because someone spoke up, and I know that this is the life I was meant to live. The conversation turned to the future, to the plans and dreams that would have been impossible to imagine during those dark days of abuse. Sophia was preparing for medical school, already talking about specializing in emergency medicine so she could be on the front lines of helping trauma victims. Carlos was considering colleges with strong art programs, wanting to use his talent to continue creating awareness about social justice issues. "And what about you?" I asked Maria. "What's next for you?" "I've been thinking about law school," she said, surprising me. "I want to understand the legal system better, to be able to help women navigate the complex process of leaving abusive relationships. I want to be able to draft legislation that actually protects people, not just creates bureaucratic obstacles." "Law school," I repeated, shaking my head in amazement. The woman who was afraid to speak up about her own abuse wants to become a lawyer. It sounds impossible, doesn't it? She laughed. But I've learned that impossible things become possible when you have people who believe in you and support you. Maria did go to law school, starting part-time while continuing her work with the district. It took her 4 years to complete her degree, studying late into the night after her children were asleep, writing legal briefs on weekends, and taking exams between advocacy conferences. I attended her graduation ceremony, watching with pride as she walked across the stage to receive her law degree. At 42 years old, she had achieved something that would have seemed like a fantasy just a few years earlier. "What kind of law do you want to practice?" I asked her at the celebration dinner afterward. "Family law," she said immediately. "I want to help women through divorce and custody battles. I want to be the lawyer I wished I had access to when I was trying to figure out how to leave Roberto." Her legal career began at a small firm that specialized in serving low-income families. She quickly developed a reputation for her compassionate approach and her ability to understand the complex dynamics of domestic violence cases. Her own experience gave her credibility with clients who had been dismissed or misunderstood by other attorneys. "She gets it," I overheard one client say to another in the waiting room. "She's been where I am. She knows what it's like to be afraid." Maria's work as a lawyer became another extension of her advocacy. She helped draft amicus briefs for domestic violence cases that went to the state Supreme Court. She lobbied for legislation that would make it easier for abuse victims to obtain restraining orders and safer for them to leave dangerous relationships. But perhaps her most important work was still the one-on-one conversations with women who found themselves in situations similar to her own. She had a gift for helping people see their own strength, their own possibilities, their own worth. "I tell them what someone once told me," she said, "that they deserve to be treated with dignity and respect, that their pain matters, that there are people who will help them, who will stand with them, who will believe them." 10 years after that first morning when I noticed the bruises on her wrists, Maria was invited to speak at a congressional hearing on domestic violence prevention. She testified about the importance of recognizing signs of abuse and the need for comprehensive support services for survivors. "Domestic violence thrives in silence," she told the committee. "It depends on victims feeling isolated, ashamed, and hopeless. But when someone notices, when someone cares enough to ask the hard questions and offer real help, that silence can be broken." She looked directly at the camera as she spoke, knowing that her words would be broadcast across the country. "To the women who are watching this, who are living in fear, who are covering bruises and making excuses for someone else's violence, you are not alone. You are not worthless. You are not trapped. There are people who will help you, who will believe you, who will stand with you as you build a new life." After the hearing, several committee members approached Maria to discuss specific legislation. One senator, a woman who had been quiet during the testimony, pulled Maria aside. I want you to know, the senator said quietly, that your story resonates with me personally. I've never spoken publicly about my own experience with domestic violence, but your courage in sharing your story has inspired me to consider how I might use my position to help other women. That conversation led to the introduction of the Domestic Violence Survivor Support Act, legislation that would provide federal funding for comprehensive services including legal aid, job training, child care, and housing assistance for abuse survivors. Maria was asked to help draft the bill and to testify in support of it. The legislation passed both houses of Congress with bipartisan support and was signed into law by the president. At the signing ceremony, Maria stood behind the president as he spoke about the importance of supporting survivors and preventing domestic violence. This law exists because of advocates like Maria Gonzalez, the president said, turning to acknowledge her. People who have transformed their own experience of trauma into a force for positive change in the world. As I watched the ceremony on television, I thought about the long journey from that morning when I noticed the bruises to this moment of national recognition. Maria had traveled so far from the frightened woman who had whispered, "Please don't ask," in my kitchen. But what struck me most was not how much she had changed, but how much she had revealed of who she had always been. The strength, the compassion, the intelligence, the determination, all of those qualities had been there all along, buried beneath layers of fear and abuse. What had happened that morning wasn't the creation of a new person. It was the uncovering of someone who had always existed but had been hidden. That realization changed how I looked at everyone around me. The quiet person at the grocery store, the reserved colleague at work, the neighbor who kept to themselves, how many of them were hiding remarkable qualities behind walls of fear or circumstance? How many potential advocates, leaders, and change-makers were simply waiting for someone to notice their pain and help them find their voice? Maria's story became a reminder that when we help someone escape from abuse, we're not just saving them from violence, we're freeing them to become who they were, always meant to be. We're removing the barriers that keep their true selves hidden from the world. The last time I saw Maria, she was preparing for another speaking engagement, this time at an international conference on human rights. She had been invited to present alongside other advocates from around the world, sharing strategies for combating domestic violence across different cultures and legal systems. "Sometimes I can't believe this is my life," she told me as we sat in her home office, surrounded by law books and advocacy materials. 10 years ago, I was afraid to speak up about my own situation. Now I'm speaking to audiences around the world about ending domestic violence. "You were always this person," I said. "The abuse didn't define you, it just hid who you really were." "I know that now," she said. "But I also know that I needed someone to see me, really see me, before I could see myself clearly. You gave me that gift when you noticed the bruises and refused to look away." As I prepared to leave that evening, Maria walked me to the door. "There's something I want you to know," she said. "Something I've never told you before." "What's that?" "That morning when you asked me about the bruises, when you said, 'Please don't ask,' I wasn't just asking you not to inquire about my injuries. I was asking you not to make me face the truth about my life. I was asking you to let me stay invisible." She paused, looking out at the street where she had built her new life. "But you didn't let me stay invisible. You saw me when I couldn't see myself. You believed I deserved better when I didn't believe it myself. You gave me the courage to become who I was always meant to be. And look what you've done with that courage," I said. "Look at all the lives you've changed, all the women you've helped, all the policies you've influenced. You've taken your pain and transformed it into healing for others. That's the thing about trauma," she said thoughtfully. "It can destroy you, or it can become the foundation for something remarkable. But it can't become something remarkable unless someone helps you see that possibility." As I drove home that night, I reflected on the extraordinary journey that had begun with a simple act of paying attention. Maria had indeed become someone remarkable, a lawyer, an advocate, a policymaker, a voice for the voiceless. But more than that, she had become a reminder that everyone has the potential for transformation, that everyone deserves to be seen and valued, and that sometimes the smallest act of caring can unleash the most powerful forces for good. The bruises on Maria's wrists had healed long ago, but they had left behind something more valuable than unblemished skin. They had left behind a commitment to ensuring that no one else would have to suffer in silence, that no one else would have to hide their pain behind professional smiles and quiet competence. In the end, that's what I learned from Maria, not just about domestic violence, but about the power of human connection and the importance of refusing to let people suffer alone. It's a lesson I carry with me every day, and one that continues to shape how I move through the world. The question isn't whether we'll encounter someone who needs help. It's whether we'll be paying close enough attention to notice them, and whether we'll have the courage to respond when we do. Because sometimes the person hiding behind a professional facade, the person who seems to have everything under control, the person who never asks for help, sometimes that person is waiting for someone to notice their silent cry for help. And sometimes, when we find the courage to respond to that cry, we don't just save a life, we unleash a force for change that ripples out far beyond anything we could have imagined. We help someone discover not just safety, but their own incredible potential to heal themselves and transform the world around them. Maria is safe now. She's thriving. She's helping others. She's changing laws and policies and lives. And it all started with a simple choice to notice, to care, and to act. That's the power we all have, and it's the responsibility we all carry. The question is, will we use it?